Okay, so Bezras Hashem, tonight we're continuing with our series of Shirim on entering the Sea of Wisdom based on the weekly Torah of the Gaon and the Tzaddik Rav Yitzchak Meir Morgenstern Shlita. And it's Zos Chanukah, which there's so much that has to be said about Zos Chanukah that we came to a point of realizing that nothing could be said, and all we can say is that this is what it is. So Zos is kind of the sum total of having so much that a person has to actually say, coming to realize the limit of human language or expression to convey the essence of what the day is, and falling back into the most essential and irreducible way of expressing what something is, and saying it is what it is. This is it. Zos Chanukah. It's also a time where the Rebbe was in Uman for Shabbos, which was one of the Zmani kibbutz by Rabbi Nachman. I believe it was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, Rosh Hashanah, and Shabbos Chanukah, and this was the first time in about 5 or 6 years that the Rebbe has been in Uman. And so the Rebbe now is in Mezhebush, actually. I just saw a video of the Rebbe davening by the kever of the Baal Shem Tov. He was by the kever of the Mittler Rebbe. So really, really important things are taking place on Zos Chanukah, with living tzaddikim, connecting with tzaddik Hadoros throughout the generations. And so it's just a special opportunity to kind of drink up the waters of the Tzaddik's Torah, to try and gain just a little bit of insight into what it could possibly mean for us, or at least for myself, where we're at. Now, the Nakuda that we're going to speak about tonight was spoken about last Shabbos. So it was Parshas Vayeshev. And Parshas Vayeshev, what the Rebbe was talking about on Friday night at the Suda, is he was quoting from the Sefer of the Rimon of Tzadikim Be'eros Mayim. And the Baal Mechaber of Nishmas and Chadasin implies that this is actually something that the Rebbe has been doing for nearly every meal, not specifically the Rimon of Svarim, but always making sure to quote from at least one of the Svarim HaKadoshim and the Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh. The Nakuda that we're going to talk about is a Nakuda that stands at the very apex, or the very center of Pnimius HaTorah, and really what the Rebbe is speaking about most explicitly, and that is the place of Tainug, of pleasure, in the centrality of pleasure in the realm of Avodas Hashem. Now, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, when a person looks at the writings of the Mekubalim, and especially as it has been revealed through the writings of the Balei Chasidus, in particular Chasidus Chabad, and in particular the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, in Hemshech Samech Vav, as well as Ayin Beis, is that when a person comes to the loftiest place in the kind of the tree of the spheros, or in the olamos, or in terms of what an individual is capable of grasping of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, in this world, we come to the level of Keser. We come to that level of desire. Keser is both the roof of the lower level, and it's also the ground floor of the level above it, which is why Keser is always Malchus. The highest level introduces us to the lowest level of the next level, ad infinitum, because all it is infinite iterations of worlds upon worlds. But suffice it to say that Keser, or Ratzon, represents the loftiest place that an individual is capable of experiencing godliness in this world. And there's a machlokas amongst the Mekubalim as to what exactly is the anthropomorphic expression. What is the human psychological translation of Keser? What does it mean to experience Keser? So there are two elements of Keser. And those two elements of Keser express themselves in Ratzon and Tainug, desire and pleasure. And there's a machlokas, especially in the writings of the Rebbe Rashab, as to which is driving which. And ultimately, the innermost essential point of Keser is Tainug, is pleasure. So pleasure clearly is not simply some fallen physical experience where a person enjoys some sort of sensuous experience, whether it be through the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, or any other part of physical experience, because obviously that is not what pleasure represents. Pleasure represents something much more delicate, something more sublime. The first step that we have to take when trying to understand what the word Tainug means in terms of Avodas Hashem is that it is non-physical. Now, Tainug can override the neshama and melt into the body as well, so that the body begins to experience the spiritual bliss as well, as Rabbi Nachman says that a person has to ensure to always make sure to be a Bal Chesed with their body, to allow the spiritual nourishment of the neshama to be tasted by the body as well. And the Rebbe in his Yud Tes Kislev Drasha of this year spoke in levels that I personally, Lefias Nias Daiti, it's not a raya, but the Rebbe has never spoken on this darga before, but it's the darga of how the body itself is in truth the loftiest side of spiritual experience. That's not an uncommon phenomenon as it's expressed in the writings of the Bali Chasidus, especially the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe. But what the Rebbe speaks about is how the guf of Moshe Rabbeinu, which was an aspect of Matat, was also the Rebbe of Moshe Rabbeinu, trying to show and reveal that the body of the tzaddik, or the body of the Jewish individual, is in truth the teacher to the neshama. And la'ased lavo, our bodies are going to be teaching our souls what it means to encounter HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But suffice it to say that pleasure is not a physiological or sensual experience, but nevertheless, pleasure is something that each and every person has to understand and translate into their own personal idiom. Like nearly any other categorization or experience in spirituality, one size does not fit all, as Rabbi Nachman explains to us immediately as a person embarks upon the journey of studying Pnimiyas HaTorah, and all of our tzaddikim in unison announce that what one person experiences is not necessarily true for the other person, but rather each and every person has their own grasp of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the two elements we have so far about Tainug are that it is not a physical pleasure and that it is not singular or uniform across the board, and each and every person has to encounter what pleasure means in their own sense. The next step in understanding pleasure, Lefi Anias Daiti, is to make a distinction between the cessation of pain and the affirmative experience of something pleasant. Typically, when we consider pleasure to be something we experience, very often we're talking about the renunciation or the cessation of pain, undoing suffering, getting rid of something that's bothering me. And while that is certainly a prerequisite in the path towards pleasure, like we spoke about last week in terms of tsur meira, for the sake of asay tov, nevertheless, the cessation of pain or the negation of displeasure is not necessarily the spiritual pleasure that the Svarim HaKadoshim are speaking about. So again, just the setup expressions that we have towards leading us to the fact that we don't know exactly what pleasure means is that, number one, it's not physical. Number two, it is something unique to each and every individual according to their own spiritual sensibilities and their psychological posture. Number three, it is not simply the cessation of suffering. And then number four leads us into that space of pleasure where no matter what pleasure is, it brings with it a sense of satisfaction. In a state of pleasure, a person feels that I have exactly what I need at this moment. I don't have to look elsewhere to find benefits. I have the benefit within myself, and I can find pleasure and presence and satisfaction and calmness and menucha and simcha and a sense of serenity, that this serene pleasure that descends upon a person when they are truly aware of the fact that they are doing everything that they possibly need to be doing. There is nothing left for them to do. There is no fear of being found out or caught or being left behind. There's no fear of missing out. It's a sense of, I find myself where I am in this moment. The person encounters their self in a quiet state of self, not self-sufficiency, God forbid, but a self-sufficiency where the self and all of its egocentric idiosyncrasies kind of melt away and meld into the Ani Ha'elyon of Ani Hashem Elokeichem, of I am HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that elevated sense of the true I of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In a state of pleasure, a person lets go of their ego and melts into whatever it is they're doing at that moment. And this inner quiet state of pleasure, of fullness, which is related to the expression of Keser within the neshama, is a guiding principle in Avodas Hashem, and especially in the Rebbe's writings in terms of the different layers and gradations of pleasure and non-pleasure and felt pleasure and unfelt pleasure and conscious pleasure, unconscious pleasure, and unconscious pleasure being made conscious, and all of the different iterations. The Rebbe, more than other tzaddikim, spoke very much about Tainug, and ultimately, as is clear from the writings of Biyam Darkecha, which are based on the Rebbe's writings, Tainug is the engine that drives all things. So with that being said, the Rebbe is going to open us up to a teaching from the Be'eros Mayim, from Rav Hirsch Meriminov, and then the Rebbe is going to kind of bring it into a place that he speaks about most specifically in Avodas Hashem. So this is on page Yud Zayin, and it's again very much connected to the light of Hanukkah, the light of Tainug of Pnimiyas HaTorah, the Tainug of Or, the Tainug of Or Haganuz that the Vilna Gaon speaks about at the end of Tzafir Ditzniusa, which is a Tainug that is so great that it overwhelms every element of conscious awareness or distinction, to the extent that a person can't even claim that I am experiencing pleasure, because the pleasure melts away the sense of self. So based on the pasuk, Yosef ben Sheva Asrei Shana, right? Yosef was 17 years old, and again, Hashkacha Pratis, this is on page 17 as well. Chazar al Kama Diburei Kodesh al Harav HaKadosh HaRebbe Rav Hirsch Mei Rimanov Tzchusi Agan Aleinu Mei Sefer HaKadosh Be'eros Mayim. So the Rebbe reviewed a number of teachings from the holy tzaddik Rav Hirsch of Rimanov from the Sefer Be'eros Mayim. Ukimedumali shekvar sheherbe shabbasos noheg lomer b'chol suda shabbos kodesh mitzvah hakadosh manal. And it appears to me, says the compiler of these teachings of the Rebbe, close Talmud of the Rebbe, that this is a sefer that the Rebbe very often kind of goes to, especially in these parshios. The Harishon Shebahem, and the first teaching that the Rebbe utilizes, and the Rebbe based his Shalosh Shudas drasha on this as well. Harishon Shebahem hu al tevois sheva esrei shana. What does it mean that Yosef was 17 years old? Hu al tevo sheva esrei shana v'zel l'shana kodesh. This is the language of Rav Hirsch Mei Rimanov. Hine ben of Ben Esrei Shana, who Melashon Havana. Ben is from the language of Bina, which means contemplation and understanding. Sheva, which really means 7, is also from the language of Sovea, which means satisfaction. And Asra Shana, Sheva Esrei Shana, Shana, which is Gematria 365, is famously the same Gematria as Sphira. So what we have here is Hainu ki haya mevin ech lahasbia etz asmai b'ha'eser Sfiros. Rav Hirsch Rimanov says that Vahaya ben Esrei Sheva Esrei Shana means that he understood, he was maven from the language of Ben, to satisfy himself from the language of Sheva through the Sfiros, which are the Gematria of Shana, meaning he drew his satisfaction, he drew his pleasure from the encounter, the contemplation of the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals himself in this world. And the teaching from Rav Hirsch Rimanover goes on, and it says, Haya Roya es Achiv, and he was kind of searching out for his brothers along with the sheep. I knew Zachalios Roa Uman Hegador, by learning how to find satisfaction through the contemplation of the spheros themselves, he was ra'i to be a leader. And the Rebbe opens up on this notion of satisfaction through the contemplation of spirituality. The Pirish Penimius Ha'inyan Bazeh. And what the Rebbe describes is as follows: Shekivan Shahaya Yosef Atzadik ben Sheva Asrei Shana Shuzman Shel Ritichas Hadamim, that because Yosef Atzadik was at a young age of 17, a time where temptation and physical pleasure were ever present on a physiological level, and it was a time in a state of concealment, in a ervas haaretz, in those constrictions of Mitzrayim, having lost himself completely, or at least externally losing himself. It was a time where he was liable to fall into the trap of this worldly pleasure. He was liable to fall into the notion that physiological pleasure, even psychological pleasure, is the driving force of existence. And therefore, specifically because that temptation, that desire for pleasure, that pleasure drive, that pleasure principle, that need to feel satisfaction, because Yosef was encountering it on a physiological level, he understood the need to double himself down and throw himself completely and unabashedly into the spiritual blissful pleasures of taking pleasure in the godly contemplation of the Sfiros and the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu interacts with the world. Like we explained elsewhere, Shemuva b'makom acher, as we explained before, that if a person wants to understand what is the proactive, affirmative stance that a person can take in this world in terms of creating holiness and purity in their lives, typically we speak about refraining, typically we speak about staying away, the negative, the tzur meirah. And what is the positive, affirmative stance that a person can make? It's finding pleasure in the relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's by getting up and ensuring that our spiritual experience brings with it a certain element of pleasure, of sustainability of feeling whole, of feeling satisfied in that moment, that is the way that a person creates the reservoir of pleasure for themselves. Like the language of the Rambam, sheyesh lisanig ba'avas Hashem b'tachlis ha'oineg v'ha'ana, that in truth, the essential way to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with the greatest amount of inner pleasure and experience possible. And this is what brings dveikus to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like Rashi tells us in Maseches Sanhedrin, she'ein dveikus ela ba'oineg, that the only way for a person to actually learn how to connect to something fully is through pleasure. Because like we said, pleasure is that sense of satisfaction, of enoughness. And if I have enough where I am, I don't need to seek out connection anywhere else. Anytime I desire to seek connection elsewhere to find external pleasures, it means that I am not drawing enough pleasure from the thing in front of me at this moment. That somebody who finds that inner quietude, that inner silent form of pleasure, not that loud pleasure, but that inner self-satisfaction, in all of its various forms. That by finding pleasure, by drawing pleasure, by becoming intoxicated on holiness, as mamela, the desire to become intoxicated on the opposite of holiness falls away. And v'hainu sur me'ra, shall all of these different things, how do we stay away? How does a person stay away? And this connects us right back to what we spoke about last week. The way that we stay away from negativity is by the aseh tov, is by throwing ourselves into kedusha, al yedei shemis'aneg al Hashem, by finding pleasure, by finding satisfaction, by allowing ourselves to take comfort in the service of God. We very rarely allow ourselves to take the prerequisite or the necessary comfort by simply being aware that I have emunah in the world. There's no greater substance in the world than emunah. It's the one thing that doesn't go away. It's the one thing that can't be extinguished. Emunah provides the self with the deep, quiet, self-soothing pleasure that emerges from the central point of the heart to make me feel like I'm okay in this moment. And when a person draws pleasure from that place, they don't have to look anywhere else for it. Like the Vitebsker Slusa Yogan Aleinu wrote in his famous letter, that Nishmas Yisrael, that the Jewish soul comes from a place of pleasure. We come from that place of Keser. We come from that place of Hisanig al Hashem. We come from that place of Oineg Shabbos. We come from that Sha'ashuim Panimium, from the inner pleasure, that unspoken pleasure of the back and forth within the self, in and of itself. We come from that place, and if we don't give room for that place to be heard properly, then we're going to be dragged across the earth to find external fallen forms of pleasure. And if we can't find that self-satisfactory pleasure through Avodas Hashem and spirituality and the Torah and mitzvos and Shabbos and Yomim Tovim and conversation, then and only then do we find ourselves falling down into the pits of despair and seeking out pleasure in Boiris Nishbaros, in empty and vacant, bankrupt places. So the avodah of Hanukkah, the avodah of the Torah of the Tzaddikim, the avodah of Pnimiyas HaTorah, like the Avnei Nezer writes in his Hakdama to his parish on the Lamites Malachos, Iglei Tal, that the Iker Nekud of Torah Lishma is to find Oineg and Hana'ah in one's learning. Because Oineg and Hana'ah, that self-satisfaction that a person encounters when they're truly present in front of something, and they allow the notion of spirituality to soothe the anxious soul, there's no greater pleasure than that. And when a person finds that Oineg, at that point, there's nothing higher than that oineg. And by throwing ourselves deeply into the ta'anugim of Torah, into the Torah of the Tzaddikei Hadoros, that way we're going to move further and further away from the desire to find that pleasure elsewhere. Be'ezras Hashem.